thank you, Dr. Shawba, not only a colleague, but a good friend that I've known many years, and we've had many Indian experiences together, and it's a pleasure being here today, and thank you for the invitation. Also to the museum and Limor and the rest of the staff for hosting this very special event. As an architect, architectural historian, and professor of architecture, my paper today focuses on a specific building typology, and that's the synagogues realized by the Baghdadi Jews in India within the context of the region's history, identity, development, and sense of place. The three primary questions that I will touch on today in the time I have are why these synagogues as tangible objects appear the way they do, what were their distinct architectural and cultural influences, and how they became mediums for elucidating the conditions of a people. This paper also calls attention to a vanishing tradition in that 6 structures built as synagogues have managed to survive, 2 in Mumbai, 1 in Pune, and 3 in Kolkata, along with 1 in Yangon, despite the overwhelming shrinkage in the Jewish population of these places beginning about 7 decades ago. Although the once vibrant communities cannot be salvaged, some of these Jewish houses of prayer, buildings left behind by the immigrating Jews, and decently maintained, not perfectly, but decently maintained today, are today being recognized as invaluable markers within Indian and Jewish history and culture. So let me begin by discussing 3 important factors that helped establish the architecture of the Baghdadi synagogues in India. Factor number 1, synagogues have rarely, if ever, conformed to stylistic rules anywhere in the world, or as a building type, been resolved in unique or recognizable terms. Why specific design rules or parameters have never been established is due in part that Judaism has never had a central authority, governing body, or dedicated text to direct precise construction, organizational, and aesthetic policies, and that Jews for ages have been a particularly dispersed and consistently small group living among more dominant communities who were affected by many traditions and influences. As Jews dispersed, and once they began building synagogues, a lack of specific design and construction traditions or dogma resulted in a huge assortment of results. Select design inspirations and guidelines, some vague and others more directed, were nevertheless established over time, such as the placement of the ark oriented towards Jerusalem as an example. Yet synagogues have always been a particularly inexact building genre. Since there are so few rules, liturgically, organizationally, functionally, aesthetically, the issue is to how to build a synagogue, what does it need to look like, and how, if at all, to express the qualities of patrons and users. The ones built by the Baghdadi Jews of India are no exception to this ambiguous practice. Factor number 2, unlike many earlier periods of Western architectural history, both in the West and in areas of the world where Western influence was pervasive, when a distinct, new, and at times more progressive, either in terms of its engineering or construction or in terms of its building theory, type of architecture was pursued, the late 18th and first half of the 19th century was an age more of an uncertainty and vagueness, an eclectic era, a mishmash era, a time without a dominant or prevalent style. Hence, there's a gap with any new architecture as far as the style goes from the end of the Baroque and Rococo period to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution age of the second half of the 19th century. Now, this doesn't mean that there weren't important buildings built during this period, or that some of these buildings are not so beautiful. But overall, it was not a period of dramatic new trends or pushing the design envelope. This certainly wasn't the first time in history when old styles had been revived. It had been done before, and it continued afterwards, and it continues to this day. Yet during this period, revivalism was the thing. There was really no other overriding option, and there was therefore a mostly conservative period, one of not moving forward, but looking backwards into the past. Overall, it was a time of recreating versus doing something new and fresh. The Baghdadi synagogues in India all were constructed during this time period, and they followed this architectural revival sensibility. Factor 3, the majority of synagogues built by the Indian Baghdadi Jews, who as urbanites settled in Kolkata, in Mumbai, Pune, and Yangon, are often imposing, if not pretentious structures, compared to the more modest ones of the Cochin, Bnei Israel Jews, and particularly for the far more recent ones built by the Bnei Menashe and Bnei Ephraim. These synagogues, Baghdadi synagogues, are in pure or eclectic English or other European revival styles, the classical, the Gothic, Renaissance, and Baroque, as per the request of the leadership of these communities. Although their ethnicity was most often Near Eastern, the Baghdadis, who considered themselves non-Indians, sought a special status under the Raj. Having arrived in India during British colonialism, they neither considered themselves natives, nor did they wish to assimilate with or conform with ways of the indigenous population, which also included the Bnei Israel. As a result, even though Baghdadi Jews in India had substantial latitude and the means to design and build buildings as they saw fit, they seemed not to have needed to conform to conditions forced or presented on them to themselves due to economic or social or political reasons. Their choice in buildings were faithfully Western buildings in response to an allegiance to the English, and that is the sort of critical point here. Though they lived in harmony for decades within a particularly multicultural and diversely religious setting, when constructing, When constructing their houses of prayer, the Baghdadi Jews, and compared to, let's say, the Cochin Jews of India when they built their synagogues, yes, much earlier, but with their synagogues, the Baghdadi Jews weren't regularly influenced by or inspired by indigenous architectural traditions and devices. They were not. When it came time to erect synagogues beginning in the mid-1800s, the relatively well-off Indian Baghdadi Jews built stately, expensive buildings with no interest in drawing from their Indian or their own West Asian precedents. Instead, Baghdadi Jews in India chose Greco-Roman orders, church-like spires, Renaissance arches, Baroque flourishes, and Gothic details devised in Europe and revived in the 19th century as primary design components for their synagogues. When seeing these buildings, foreigners and nationals alike are often surprised, but they regard as what seems un-Indian and sometimes even Christian. Yet in the British colonial landscape, these buildings were in keeping with the taste of the time. And this reveals much about the social standing and aspirations of the Indian Baghdadi Jewish communities. In building as they did, the Baghdadi Jews decided not to draw from the religious and secular traditions, architectural traditions ingrained from their past, considering that some blending of traditions, Buddhist elements applied to early Hindu temples, indigenous Indian inspirations on Delhi's Sultanate, Mughal, and Raj designs, or local influences on Cochin synagogues, all resulted in some very poetic work. The fact that Baghdadi Jews in India never attempted their own brand of architecture. May not be altogether surprising, but nevertheless a bit disappointing. So let me now go back. I'm going to show you some images. Yeah, the very big. Is that the very beginning? No. Am I going the wrong way? Oh, but now we have to do the PowerPoint. But just the beginning. Thank you. So instead, Ohel David, constructed in 1863 on an expansive lawn on a very prominent site in Pune camp. Now, while in the United States and Europe, few Gothic revival synagogues were built given their sort of Christian association. In India, it seemed a suitable architectural style distinct from native religions. The synagogue and its endowment were made possible by David Sassoon, and as we know, the Sassoons funded several other buildings and several other synagogues in India. Now, this synagogue was designed by an architect, an English Christian architect, Henry Stanley Wilkins. He was a British Army officer. He served in the East India Company, and he was employed in the fields of engineering and architecture and did a lot of buildings during British India. It's a very large and impressive sanctuary that could accommodate more than 100 families. Its most prominent feature is its 90-foot-tall tower. Its clock was sort of manufactured in London, and the design of the tower closely resembles the tower at the Sassoon Hospital, also designed by Wilkins. Dating even earlier from the mid-1850s, Beth El Synagogue on Pollock Street in Kolkata has served the congregation for more than 1.5 centuries. Its construction was made possible by funding from David Joseph Ezra and Ezekiel Judah, two local Baghdadi Jews, and in 1885 to accommodate a growing community. So unlike today, it was in fact enlarged. And it was the enlargements were paid for by another member of the community, alias Shalom Gube. Now, this synagogue is sort of an eclectic Western-inspired design, inspired by many influences, some Gothic, some Baroque, some classical. It's really a very hybrid design, but still very, very sort of Western-inspired, and very much a revival building in the tradition that I sort of mentioned earlier. Now, Stars of David and menorah appliques to the facade of the synagogue, seen and painted in blue, highlight the building as an important civic building. And it is sort of a recognized important civic building within central Kolkata. Now, the one interesting thing about the synagogue, there are many interesting things, but one interesting thing, and this is a watercolor I did of the interior some years ago, it has sort of a classic tripartite design divided by sort of this colonnade, these very tall and thin columns in response to the Industrial Revolution are sort of iron following around the 1820s in England and throughout its colonies. As a result of the Industrial Revolution, sort of iron was incorporated. So this was one response to sort of the times, but otherwise the building is sort of a very sort of a revival, conservative, sort of European historicist building. Another very interesting thing are sort of the very large hekals in many of, not all, but many of these Baghdadi synagogues. You open the doors and they seem to confront very conventional hekals, but in fact, the rooms are quite large, more spacious than New York City's studio apartments in some cases, where up to 100 or more of Torahs were stored. And here you see an example at the bottom left. Now, also in Kolkata, again, David is one of the grandest and largest of all synagogues in Asia, as we've heard earlier. And it's for more than a century and a quarter been a landmark in the city. It was completed a bit later in 1884. It was designed, again, by a British Christian colonial architect based in India who was well-versed in English and other European building traditions. It's a very sort of faithful, sort of Renaissance revival building with the rounded arches, the repetition of bays, and again, it has this very distinct feature, the tower in the corner. Again, with its clock manufactured in England. Its interior contains some sort of very sort of beautiful sort of details and very high-end, impressive finishes. Next door is Neve Shalom. It was organized in the mid-1820s, and it was the first congregation of Baghdadi Jews who had settled permanently in India during the early years of the 19th century. The first building dates from 1830, and it was taken from a converted residence that was transformed into a prayer hall. In time, this building was demolished, and Magen David, the synagogue I just showed you, was built on the site. And in the early 20th century, on a site adjacent, was this sort of building that you see here. A watercolor done several years ago before the synagogue was restored just a couple of years ago, beautifully restored by the community. And so here you see it in its condition from the 1990s, sort of taken over by street vendors and billboards and so forth. And here you see it as a result of a recent restoration. It was done in 2013 and the beginning of 2014, is that right now? And a very fine restoration that brought the building back to form. Now, this synagogue remains in Jewish hands. The other two have been passed over, and and today guardianship control of the buildings or maintenance of the building is by the Architectural Survey of India, the ASI. But here the community and supporters of the community, again, did a very beautiful job in restoring this synagogue. Now, this building is a bit later, and by this point, the revival tradition had faded a little bit, and so stylistically, this building is difficult to label or describe. It's not sort of stylistically pure. And here's a very recent picture that I took of the interior of this synagogue. The women's gallery. Here's the very large ark, another example of these quite sort of unusually, sort of for synagogues around the world, sort of unusually generous sort of. Okay, here I am with the assistance of Yael and with the cooperation of the India Jewish Heritage Center, with the collaboration with Ruthie Greenfeld hanging a sort of a heritage plaque on the synagogue. And then finally, I'll need about 1 or 2 minutes, please. These are just the synagogues that the Baghdadi synagogues in Mumbai. Magen David, that was sort of finished in, let me remember the dates. In the early 1880s, and then expanded in the early 20th century, these side bays, to accommodate a larger community. Again, with this very sort of church-like tower, some interior views. Charles had shown some of these earlier in the different paint schemes. This is a watercolor I did when it was of this color scheme. And then finally, Knesset Eliyahu, a slightly later synagogue in the Fort area of Mumbai. That's an English composite, part English Renaissance, part English Baroque synagogue. And then the last image is of the B'nai Israel synagogue. The Baghdadi Synagogue in Yangon. A slightly more modest synagogue than the ones in India.